guess I'm really a product of the counterculture. And the counterculture being 1980s weird music. And through weird music and all the weirdnesses that go with it, I started reading around these subjects. And the subjects tended to be things like William Burroughs and the occult, and ghost stories were all part of that. I was reading a lot of magic and occultism, and I guess one of the biggest influences on my reading has been Aleister Crowley. And he was obviously the wickedest man in the world, the great beast, and the one I really like is John Simmons' The Great Beast, and it's got a fantastic cover on it, and there's various editions, and really a lot of Crowleyites really hate him because he stuck the knife into Crowley. And I think one of the great mysteries of Crowley and Simmons is how on earth Simmons became Crowley's literary executor. When he died, he wrote this biography, and it's quite obvious that he really doesn't like Crowley very much at all. And I think Crowley's made it a very astute move to pick somebody who didn't like him, because he was obviously a man who knew good publicity, and probably Simmons' book really put Crowley on the map. I think later on Crowley would have emerged anyway, because although there is the sex and the scandal and the drugs and everything else associated with him, he was actually a very interesting chap, and he had some interesting ideas. And I think that his main ideas that people should try and develop themselves and come into contact with their upper self, or what he termed the holy guardian angel, is a good thing. Understand yourself, get yourself sorted out in some way. And he was obviously a product of his time, and sex and drugs and whatever the equivalent of rock and roll at that time were the ways forward. But he was certainly a doer, and he was a mountain climber, and if you believe everything that he said, he was the best mountain climber in the world, and he was the best poet of his generation, and he was the best of everything, and he had a terrible ego problem for somebody who really was trying to get everybody to move away from their egos perhaps and find themselves and find their place in the cosmos. I was also interested in the followers or the people who came into contact with him and actually worked with him in some way. And there's differing strands really, and one of them is a biography of Victor Neuburg by Jean Overton Fuller. And Neuburg was a poet and seems to be all round sensitive soul and good chap. And he was really interested in spiritual development and ended up outside somewhere in Tunisia and performed a series of magical rituals in the desert with Crowley, and the result of which really seemed to have some bad effects on Neuburg, and Neuburg really couldn't speak about Crowley for a number of years afterwards, and I think that a lot of his Neuburg's supporters really never forgave Crowley for what happened. Anyway, it's another really great read, and what I think is interesting about that is that it says a lot about Neuburg, it says a lot about Crowley, and it says a lot about the times that everybody was moving in. Fairly rich, affluent people coming into contact with somebody who obviously had a huge amount of personal force. Personal charm might possibly be the wrong word. So there's enough in Crowley's teachings to keep everybody happy forever, one would imagine. But all these things are ongoing processes, and Crowley really believed that there should be a scientific application towards magic, and that you should take your theory, take your ritual, apply it. If it doesn't work, well, why doesn't it work? And maybe it should be refined. And these people took that maxim and applied it. And so, in that respect, whether you believe what they're doing is true or right or wrong or whatever, they applied the maxim and wandered off into some quite strange territory. And some of the strangest territory is pursued by Kenneth Grant, and this is The Magical Revival, which is the first book of a series of 9, and this one is sort of a history of magic from Crowley onwards. And as the series goes on, the books start to get stranger and stranger and stranger, in that Grant firstly starts messing about with Crowley's system and played with it a bit, and he also started to integrate lots of other things like voodoo particularly, and a lot of supernatural fiction authors, the Blackwood and bits of Machen and a lot of Lovecraft, and then odd people like Sax Rohmer, and also was very interested in the idea of extraterrestrial communications, and a lot of his books, which start off in quite a normal manner, and The Magical Revival is one of his very straightforward books compared to the later ones, and then it starts to drift off into territory of communications which may or may not be extraterrestrial. There are elements of autobiography, and there are elements of magical teaching, and then there is other stuff which I have no idea a lot of the time what on earth is going on about, because his numbering systems seem to chop and change a bit, and you don't know, the willfully obscure demons that you've never ever heard of, all linked up with other things you've never really heard of, and it's a terrible mishmash to work through. But what's great about them, and what I really like about them, is that you feel there's, even if it's all utter rubbish, and I'm not saying that it might not be utter rubbish, but he definitely believed it, and he applied it, and he pursued this path, and a lot of other people also believe that where he went was very interesting territory, and following that line as well. So I think that the later books are really super tough reads indeed, but The Magical Revival and Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God are great books for understanding Crowley and his magical principles. I could have picked out any number of other books, but what I picked out, because it's so hard to find and so utterly barking mad, is Zeus is Zeniz by C.F. Russell. And Zeus is Zeniz is a great title, and it was one of those books which I never thought I would see, and discovered in a bookshop in California. No surprise there really. And it has what they call homely production values, which is a great term for it's really done at home and a bit rubbish really. And part of it, and what I thought when I picked it up, because it is the memoirs of a magician, is the autobiography, and in particular his associations with Crowley, and that's of course where my interest in Russell begins. And it's written in a interesting style, to say the least of it, and you think, oh yeah, well this is good, and then as we go through, it starts to get stranger and stranger and stranger, and he starts taking the hexagrams of the I King and starts applying number to it, and very quickly it becomes so incomprehensible that you have no idea at all about what is going on. So I pulled out a copy of The Source Apprentice by Hans Heinz Evers, and this is one of my very favourite novels by one of my very favourite authors. And I came to Evers maybe about 15-20 years ago, when, like most people, I read The Spider, and it's a fantastic story, and it has, for me, elements of Lovecraft in it, but it also has elements of, well, certainly elements of obsession and perversity. It's got so many great aspects of it, all melded together. And this is actually a fake dust jacket, The Source Apprentice. It's illustrated by Marlon Blaine, and it's one of the few books I remember reading in one sitting. And in fact, the only other book I can remember reading in one sitting is Hope Hodgson's House on the Borderland. And the story is basically, there's a character called Frank Brown, and he goes off to a little Austrian mountain top where there's a whole pile of peasants up there, and he decides it will just be fun to see if he can exercise some control over the peasants and create himself a cult. And years and years later I found out this was actually based on a true story of cults and madness, so it hits so many of those spots which I really like. Cults and occultism, and the mind and how you can manipulate it, etc., etc. And of course, having read that, I thought, oh, I have to read everything else, and started really digging about into Evers' background. And you discover that he is also an incredibly interesting character, and he's a character like Crowley, and in that Crowley and Evers were both doers. They got on and did stuff. And Evers was a poet and sort of a proto-performance artist, and he wrote some screenplays. And he was a spy for the Germans in the First World War, and actually ran into Crowley when they both worked on the same propaganda newspaper on the German side in New York. He travelled, he was interested in magic and mysticism, and he was interested in taking on drugs. He was interested in both men and women, so really he was very much a sort of German version of Crowley. And he ended up falling in with the National Socialists. Evers really seems to be a total horror, and post-war Evers' star was definitely on the wane, and nobody would really touch him. Nobody really wanted to touch a Nazi author, and there was very little stuff translated into English, and that had all been done in the 30s anyway, so nobody was really dashing to reprint them or do new translations. And I think it's a real shame that he has really disappeared, and I'm sure it is really because of his Nazi connections. And for me, people's lives and people's politics, however reprehensible, doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't great artists or great writers. And I think for a good example, that's Günter Grass, who said a few years ago that he'd been a member of the Waffen-SS. That doesn't mean to say that Günter Grass's novels are suddenly terrible novels, and I think the same thing applies to Evers. Now then, as you can see, there's a whole pile of Evers' books here, a little bit of a shelf, and some of them are in German. And why would I collect books in German which I don't even read? I can justify this in various ways. Some of them, like this book here, and look, it's 2 editions of the same book, is Hans Evers' Brevier. And Brevier is put together by a couple of his friends, and I suspect with a lot of help from Evers, and it's basically Evers' philosophy on various things: love and life, and the fatherland, religion, etc. And I have 2 versions of the book because this one is signed by Evers himself, so that's got to be a good thing. And this one, sadly not signed by Evers, is the limited edition hand-coloured one with a totally different design to that one. So of course I have to have 2 versions of that. Some of his books were illustrated by his wife, who was quite a decent artist, and this is a copy of Alrune, which is probably his most famous book, and it's the Mandrake myth, really. And it's got this absolutely fantastic colour, and it's an early edition. And then of course I can't resist picking up things which is handled or weird things in translation, so this is another little thing for an opera called The Dead Eyes. Again, it's illustrated by his wife, and inside it's got a little billboard for it, for a little advertising piece for it, from 1st of September 1918. And I love ephemera, and so something like this I can justify because it's Hans Evers' ephemera. And then occasionally something really odd will turn up, and these are contracts signed between Evers and his second German publishing house, which just seemed too good to turn down. And then occasionally you see little publicity photos, because as I said, Evers was a great egotist, and there's one of them inside this little thing here. Oop, if I open it the right way around, and there he is, looking rather nice, I think. And you can set him up, and it's a signed thing as well. And there are various book plates and things and other bits and pieces kicking around the place. So one of my latest interests are sort of forgotten artists of the 20s. and well, some are definitely incredibly well known. I mean, the Harry Clarks of this world, and I like people like Henry Keane. This is the picture of Dorian Gray, which is probably his best illustrated one, and I particularly like Alan Odell, who illustrated only a few books, but was suitably fantastic. This is a copy of, well, the 2 copies of the Gypsy magazine, and the Gypsy has fantastic artwork by Odell, and it's got very interesting contents because it has Edgar Jepson and Edmund Goss, and there's some Arthur Machen and A.E. Waite and De la Mare. So it was really quite something. It only ran for 2 issues. This is the rather nice first one, although mine's obviously suffered. And then you can see that it was going to fall on hard times already, and it becomes a more slender paperback. Although it still has, some great names in it. Henry Savage, and again the second bit by Machen, but primarily you have it for the Odell illustrations, which are great. My other great interest, especially at this moment, is Beresford Egan. And Egan is a really great artist of the 20s and deserves to be better known. And I like black and white because I like the hard, crisp line. And whereas something like Beardsley is a soft and sinuous line, Egan stuff is harder edged and more satirical and pointed. And his first book was a book called The Sink of Solitude, and it was really a satire of The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall. But where he really got into his own was where he did illustrations for an essay on Dessart, which was actually written by his wife and illustrated by him, and a version of Fleur de Mal as well, which were also translated by his wife. It's on his own press. This is the first edition. It's a signed one, and it's really wonderful. The poems have been turned into prose, and they have a whole collection of decadent 20s deco. There's also a version of Dessart. This one was very kindly given the prospectus for Dessart, which has a nice illustration. And this one was done by the Fortune Press. First edition features a drawing with a young girl in it, and that run foul of obscenity laws. So the Fortune Press took them out, and Egan did another drawing. And if you compare the two, and you can compare the two in actually the Beresford Egan Tartarus book written by Adrian Woodhouse, you can see that the replacement drawing, which features John Bull whipping some other, slightly older girl, obviously, tied to a post in the nude, is far more offensive than the original. Again, it's just those weirdnesses which I think Egan really railed against, and there's another book called Policeman of the Lord, in which he takes to task the censors and moralists of the day. Egan, after the 20s, he did more commercial work, and I think his drawings became more commercial and cartoony, and somewhat less interesting for me, I must confess. So downstairs are books, and upstairs is what we euphemistically call the archive, which is where all the other stuff I don't really know what to do with but seem to have accumulated seems to reside in various box files. As I say, I've been accumulating stuff for a long time now, but really since the early 80s, when I was sort of part of the whole industrial music culture. And even then I was starting to put stuff away and file stuff up and keep a record of counterculture, particularly all the music fanzines and things, which were really the things that inspired me most at the time. And I've neatly packed them all up and put them all away. Let's try and drag out something from here. Reuters, this is ripped and torn. Shape. But what I wanted to try and show you is this one, which is put together by a chap called Jeff Rushton. It was done from his school, the earliest issues at least, and he went on to become John Balance and Coyle. And I wrote to him for a little while. I've still got some letters and things filed away from him, and he was all round good chap. And really, this was all the type of thing I was listening to at great length and probably at high volume. And whenever I would go to gigs in London, I would always go to the fanzine store and I would pick up pretty much everything I saw. And that's one of the things I really came away with, was the idea of doing it yourself. The whole punk ethic, I never really cared for punkers' music. It seemed too loud and too noisy. But I really did take away the whole DIY ethic. As I say, I was especially interested in Throbbing Gristle. I was an enormous fan. And they really had a big influence on me because they were sort of art rockers, art weirdos. And their list of interesting things sort of became my list of interesting things. And so their subjects became things which I thought, maybe I should read up about that. And they were great sources because it was a mixture of magic and mysticism and occultism and deviance and the whole caboodle. So this is my own little magazine, or what's left of it, the master copies. And these are the masters of the first issue. This is a homely production values, to say the least, all badly bashed out on a bad old rubbish typewriter, all hand coloured in with felt tips and glued up somewhat poorly, somewhat stained, etc., etc. And I tried to cram in as much stuff as I possibly could. There were 4 issues and a couple of cassettes. And every time I would try and find interesting people to interview, and really I stopped doing it because I couldn't find enough interesting people, and I thought when I was bored doing something then I would stop doing it. So one of the people I love most of all is the artist Austin Osman Spare, and Kenneth Grant was really the person who brought Spare to the fore, and it all started out with this book, which is Images and Oracles, and it speaks a bit about his philosophy and everything else. His theory of magic was really that whereas Crowley would focus on the object in hand, whereas Spare's method was to try and forget about all of that, to try and draw out a glyph or sigil as they became known, and then try and forget that and to try and dissociate yourself through various techniques until you enter some sort of weird limbo state, neither one thing nor another, and then hopefully the sigil, which had been lurking in the back of your head, would pop into your mind and then things would start to happen. I'm not a big fan of his writings, I have to say, but I am an enormous fan of his drawings and artwork, which are strange. They're beautiful because he can really draw. They're unworldly, unearthly. He had a sense of the grotesque, and they're just beautiful, beautiful things. He's a pure outsider artist. So this is a copy of one of his books. It's The Focus of Life, and these are all, the camera won't pick it all up, but they're all just beautiful little swirly animals and beasties and curves and like within it. And as time went on, he really started to experiment, and I think that was sort of partly his downfall, that in some ways he was maybe a bit ahead of his time. And certainly he has some very grotesque, a grotesque view of the world, and I think that his work looks at atavisms, and so you have people who have animals and things growing out of themselves, or distorted, or twisted around, or mutated into other forms, and they're absolutely wonderful. This is the Book of Ugly Ecstasy, which is a collection of sketches, and nobody necessarily knows quite what they mean, and I think if someone can learn anything from it, that it really is, do it yourself. Find whatever you do and do it to the best of your ability. I think that these sort of blur that line between the classically trained artist and art and spare, as I say, he knew about art and the history of art, and the whole automatism, outsiderism, surrealism, the whole caboodle. I really like wandering around the outskirts of surrealism before Pope Breton kicked everybody out. And there's some very interesting people who really are what I would call outsider artists, or people who really worked entirely outside the norm. And other people who you wouldn't necessarily expect to be in the surrealist camp are there, like people like Brian Gysin, who invented the cut-up with Burroughs in the 50s. He was actually in the first surrealist show. Anyway, one of the very oddest of them all, and it was a toss-up between this chap, Pierre Molinière, or Hans Bellmer, but Hans Bellmer is probably better known. And this is a couple of books by Molinière. Molinière was a painter and photographer, but primarily I would say he was a photographer. And he was concerned with the body and his own fetishes, which seemed to involve transgender, stocking fetishes, and the whole caboodle. And he had a collection of the strange and the bizarre, and seemed to be a good chap. There he is with a cat, so that's got to be a good thing. And the books and drawings and illustrations are all of his own fetishes. He would take images of himself and he would morph them together of him dressed up in stockings or dummies' heads or masks or whatever, and he would produce all of these things in his own studio, which was in a basement somewhere in Normandy, I think it was. And he would live this very weird, very, very odd life. And what I love about Molinière, besides the very thought of him in his basement constructing all these wonderful things painstakingly by hand, and I've seen some of the original photos and they're postcard size, so the amount of work and time and effort that must have gone into it, and the very fact it's his own very personal world, all constructed and built. But this is probably the one that really kicked off the whole term in the UK, which is Roger Cardinals Outside of Art. And this is 1972. Whilst a lot of people who appear in this book were institutionalised in the 19th and 20th century, this is not really the norm. There are a lot of other people who created works entirely spontaneously and who were not considered to be mad, but lived in society and were just seen as eccentrics. What holds them all together is that they seem to work outside the boundaries of the traditional art world. So the book also includes environments and automatic writing and mediumistic art, and tries to put forward the idea that all of these are valid forms of expression, which I guess in the 70s it was quite an unusual thing to do, these untrained artists without a gallery, these people who were locked away. And now of course it's quite mainstream, you can go to college and leave and call yourself an outsider artist. I like the people who are really untrained and produce stuff with as little link to culture as possible. And people like, this is Henrik Anton Muller, who was locked away for a while and did these just amazing drawings and built some machines as well. I don't know whether the machines are actually in this book, all built out of twigs which he exhibited. Maybe the best known of them all is a chap called Adolf Wolfli, who was institutionalised for a very long time and produced something like a 4 million word biography which stands the height of him and has musical notation running around all of his works, which in theory he would play on paper trumpets and all this type of thing. Never left an institution. And others, of course, incredibly poignant. Women who were locked away and produced work who would never saw the light of day. This is a sketchbook by a woman called Eloise, and she was institutionalised. She had sort of schizophrenic moments and believed that she was in love with the Kaiser and wrote him love notes and things. And when you know all this history, and you look at all these drawings, you know, full of romance and lost love and things, firstly they're great drawings in themselves. I really, really like them, and they're fantastic expressionist things. And when you know the history and you see that these are all princesses, you know, they have quite a beauty to them. And I think a lot of the artists which I find interesting are people who, again, have their own particular view and take on life. And I think that's what I like in my writers and my artists.